Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Janice Law, L-A-W. I'm the founder of 13-year-old American Women Writers National Museum. We're a 501c3, and our mission is to honor America's premier women writers, historic and contemporary. We met for many years for lunch at the National Press Club, but then COVID came along and changed all the procedures, et cetera, at the press club. And so now we're exclusively on Zoom, and we're virtual on Zoom. Today, we're going to discuss a pioneer American women journalist, Anne Cottrell Free, and the title is a little bit of a rhyme. Journalist Anne Cottrell Free, who saw and made history. She lived from 1916 to 2004, and she's a pioneer journalist who worked for the Washington Post, the Washington Star, Newsweek, and other major publications in an era when there were very, very few women in those arenas. And a journalist historian, very famous, Dr. Maurine Beasley, is going to be our first speaker. And she is professor emerita at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she taught for more than 3 decades at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Brought up in Sedalia, Missouri, Maurine holds bachelor's degrees in history and journalism from the University of Missouri-Columbia, a master's degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and a PhD in American history, in American civilization from George Washington University. Dr. Beasley is the author or contributor editor of 8 books, dealing mainly with the history of Washington women journalists and media coverage of first ladies. 4 books concentrate on the career of Eleanor Roosevelt, herself a journalist. And Beasley is a member of the National Press Club, where she serves on the History and Heritage Committee and on the American Newswomen's Club. Our second speaker and co-presenter will be Elissa Free. She's the daughter of Anne Cottrell Free. I understand her role will be mainly showing photos of her very famous mother, but I would like you to know something about Elissa Free. Elissa was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Her parents were journalists, Anne Cottrell Free and James S. Free, who was a Washington correspondent for the Birmingham News for 33 years. She attended college at Ohio Wesleyan University, St. Clair Hall in Oxford, and Macalester College. After graduation, she worked as a production assistant researcher at the Washington Bureau of CBS News for Face the Nation and CBS Morning News. In 1980, she joined CNN a month before it started and held a variety of positions at the network for 21 years. That in itself would be another interesting topic for a future program. She was served as producer, executive producer, and newsroom manager in the network's Washington Bureau. After leaving CNN, she served as executive director of communications at Georgetown University Law Center for 12 years. She currently serves on the Journalism Awards and Headliner Committees of the National Press Club and on the board of Veg Society DC. She's an active volunteer in the areas of animal protection and plant-based nutrition. So we're honored to have both of these outstanding women speaking about another outstanding woman. By the way, if you have questions for these women, if you would email them later on, if you would like to email them, you can email them to the American Women Writers National Museum. Our email is awwnm1@gmail.com. So I'm going to turn it over now to our first speaker, Dr. Maurine Beasley.
Good afternoon. Elissa Free and I would like to thank Janice Law very much for giving us this opportunity to reflect on the remarkable career of Elissa's mother, Anne Cottrell Free, journalist, activist, author. Her pioneer accomplishments included coverage of Eleanor Roosevelt's women-only press conferences at the White House, circling the globe to report on the devastation of following World War II, and particularly publicizing animal rights. In fact, she was really the first journalist to do this. She also joined with Rachel Carson to expose environmental dangers in another path-breaking effort. Now, she died, as Janice told us, in 2004. But recently, she has been in the news again because the Library of Congress now has processed its extensive collection of her personal papers, so many that it took 2 truckloads these papers to get to the Library of Congress. The library has opened them for researchers. That's the library's manuscript division. Opened them for researchers interested in the history of notable women journalists who made an impact on a male-oriented profession in the 20th century. To illustrate Anne's career, Elissa herself, who's had a notable career, as Janice told us, is going to show you some of the photographs from Anne's papers at the Library of Congress. I'm going to ask her for some personal recollections involving these photographs. And I will provide some basic biographical facts on Anne. Now, her early life, born in Richmond, Virginia in 1916, she spent summers in the small town of Louisa, Virginia, where her grandfather was publisher of the local newspaper. And there she honed her love both of journalism and of animals and the natural world. She attended the Collegiate School for Girls in Richmond and was graduated from Barnard College of Columbia University in New York in 1938. Always interested in adventure. After graduation, she had a brief stint as a press agent in Hollywood. And then she went to New York, where she was hired by Newsweek magazine to clip newspaper stories at its New York headquarters. In those days, that's about all a woman was allowed to do on a news magazine. However, because she was extremely capable, Newsweek did send her to its Washington office in 1940, and she actually became the first full-time woman Washington correspondent for Newsweek. She subsequently moved in the same capacity to the Chicago Sun and then to the very prestigious New York Herald Tribune. Now, of course, this was partly because newspapers were forced to replace men who were drafted for World War II, and they had to hire women. But nevertheless, Anne was a person of remarkable ability. However, she encountered considerable prejudice. Lisa, would you tell us about that, please?
Sure thing. Let me share the screen. It'll just take a sec. Bear with me and pull up the photo. Now, is everyone seeing the photo of my mother at typewriter?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, great. So this photo was taken at her desk on the 12th floor of the National Press Building in the 40s. I don't know whether it was at Newsweek or Chicago Sun or the New York Herald Tribune, because she worked at all three between 1940 and 1945. But she would tell me that the 12th floor of the National Press Building was the place to be if you were a journalist in Washington, D.C. in the 1940s, because all of the important news bureaus were located there, magazines and newspapers. She also said that at the end of a long working day, her colleagues, all men, would retire upstairs to the National Press Club for drinks and to relax, and she couldn't go with them because it was men only. So I'm gonna kick it back to you, Maureen.
Okay, well, that shows us how women were discriminated against in Washington news circles in those days. And that's why Eleanor Roosevelt set up her women-only press conferences, held weekly when she was First Lady from 1933 until 1945. And these were actually held in the White House. However, Elissa, could you show us a picture of one of these press conferences?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Maureen. My mother really enjoyed working with you, Maureen, when she contributed chapters to your wonderful Eleanor Roosevelt Encyclopedia, including the chapter on Mrs. Roosevelt's women-only press conferences. And that's one of them.
Yes, and this press conference wasn't actually at the White House, but it was at the Office of Civil Defense when Eleanor Roosevelt was assistant director there for 6 months in the late 1941 and then the early 1942 period. But I do want to tell you about what Anne remembered, particularly of these press conferences at the White House. She painted for me a vivid picture of mature women. And notice how most of the women in this picture are not young. Anne is at the extreme left as I'm looking at the screen. And she is the young woman with the nice smile and the big button on her lapel. But at any rate, she told me about the way these women were so excited to go to the press conferences that they would run up the stairs at the White House so they could get front row seats and be able to easily shake Eleanor's hands. Why did Eleanor set these up? Because she knew women were having a hard time getting jobs, and she wanted to give women news that men could not get. And sometimes she did, besides telling the women, of course, about her own activities. One news item that sparked a lot of attention in those days, 1933, is when Eleanor announced the end of prohibition at the White House. This and some other items that Eleanor would tell the women enabled them to scoop their male rivals. Now, Anne, even though she was much younger than most of these people, was elected chair of Mrs. Roosevelt's Press Conference Association in 1943. Would you like to tell us, Elissa, about Anne's friendship with and admiration for Eleanor Roosevelt?
Sure. Let me just add that the dues for that organization, the Press Conference Association, were $1. 1943. Well, yeah, my mother greatly admired Mrs. Roosevelt and her activist agenda for social justice. It actually inspired my mother. It had a profound influence on her life, and it encouraged her to always try to help those in need and champion the underdog. And as you said, my mother's on the left there she has the round circle on her lapel. I think she's about 26 years old in that photo. And this photograph, by the way, is hanging on the wall at the National Press Club in the Roosevelt Nook in the Fourth Estate Room. And I hope it's going to also be going up at the Women's National Democratic Club in Washington, D.C. in the Eleanor Roosevelt Room. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Maureen.
Okay, well, after the war ended, Anne went to China as a special correspondent for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. Her journalistic instincts led her to expose Chinese government corruption that prevented relief supplies from being delivered to those who needed them. Her emphasis was always on writing about ordinary people, not necessarily officials, although she did interview Zhou Enlai. Now, here we see her surrounded by refugee children. And Elissa, would you show us pictures of Anne on the Great Wall of China after you tell us about this picture? Well, maybe you can.
Well, sure. Okay, well, I'll stay on this picture first. So this picture was taken by photographer Arthur Rothstein, who was working for UNRWA at the time. And he later went on to be a very famous photographer, very well known for his, especially for his American Dust Bowl photos. But my mother herself took hundreds of photos. When she traveled all over China, she was documenting famine and other terrible humanitarian conditions. And all of those photos are now housed in the Library of Congress. And I just want to say, I think I can see it if I enlarge the picture, but my mother in that picture is wearing an ID bracelet that says, and I'm wearing it today, Anne Cottrell, correspondent, Shanghai, Washington, D.C. And then it has her mother's address in Richmond, Virginia on the back, I guess, in case something had happened to her and she had to be identified. So I guess I'll go ahead to the next photo. Do you want me to talk about that now, Maureen?
Oh, yes.
Okay, sure. Okay. So this photo was taken by journalist Seymour Topping, who later became a well-known foreign correspondent and China expert. I think they took the train as a day trip together out from Peking, called Peking, the now Beijing, out to the Great Wall just one day to relax and have fun and take pictures. So that's what I know about that.
Well, I think it shows.
1946. Okay.
I'm
Back
sorry. Intervene to interrupt you, but I just wanted to point out that Seymour Topping, yeah, he became a leading correspondent for the New York Times, and he was among the most well-known journalists of his day, and it just shows how Anne was connected. She was part of the circle of people who really counted in journalism. In 1947, she became a roving correspondent through 14 countries, writing for the New York Herald Tribune and other newspapers. Now, this picture is so interesting because it shows her witnessing the transfer of power in India, from India being a possession of the British Empire to an independent country. Here she's busily recording history. Would you tell us more about that, Elissa?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, this was taken on a very historic day, August 15, 1947. And, you know, she's in this picture, she's holding a movie camera, but I don't know how she did it because she had a film of what was going on, but she also took a ton of still photographs. And then she wrote stories, of course, and then she wrote letters, great detailed letters home to her mother, and it put long entries in her diaries, and all of that is in the Library of Congress. And she, as you mentioned, she took photos all over the world, and all of those photographs are there in the library's collection. And I think Maurine's going to mention this later, but in 1948, she was in post-war Europe working for the Marshall Plan, and part of her job was writing stories and taking photographs there as well. And those photos, fortunately, are preserved and open to the public in the library.
Yes, well, let's move on to the next picture. And it also shows Anne in a war zone. This is in 1947, when she is covering the conflict on the border of Greece, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. Would you like to tell us about her connection with the famous journalist George Polk?
Yes, so she had been visiting George Polk in Cairo in 1947, and he said to her, "You really should go to the border, the Greek, Bulgarian, Yugoslavian border, and see what's going on with the Greek Civil War." So she did, and I wish I knew who took this photo. It's a great photo. And she did, but tragically, just a few months later, George Polk was murdered while covering the Greek Civil War. Very sad. Maurine,
yes.
back to you.
Right. And then she was all over Europe at this time. Here, let's look at the next picture. It shows her with Eleanor Roosevelt in Geneva when Eleanor Roosevelt was working on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, probably one of the most important documents in the world at this point, truly. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the guiding spirit behind producing the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Elissa, could you tell us about how you set up the award at the Old Women's National Press Club in honor of Eleanor?
Well, yeah, actually, my mother in the 1960s initiated this the establishment of the annual Eleanor Roosevelt Golden Candlestick Award. It was part of the Women's National Press Club. And I'm not sure how many years they presented that award, but the last actual candlestick itself was made by Galton Brothers in Washington, D.C., and sat in my mother's basement for many years. It's now part of the collection of the Library of Congress. They usually don't take artifacts, but they did take this. And the inscription on that candlestick reads, "She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world." Maurine?
Yes, I think we ought to note that the Women's National Press Club went out of existence, and what was left of it joined the National Press Club in 1985, but some of the material from the Old Women's National Press Club is at the National Press Club today. Well, in 1950, Anne returned to Washington and was married to James Free, Washington correspondent for the Birmingham, Alabama News. And their daughter, Elissa, who's right here, was born in 1955. Now we move to the third fascinating area of Anne's career, which was that of the animal rights advocate and environmentalist. In the late 1950s, Anne, a young mother at this time, and also a Washington correspondent for the North America Newspaper Alliance, turned to animal rights, a subject that she had been passionate about for years. A very dedicated vegetarian herself, and a true pathbreaker in the animal rights field. She wrote articles that exposed the needless cruelty toward beagles that were used in the testing of colored dye by the Federal Food and Drug Administration. Her work helped lead to passage of the Federal Humane Slaughter and Animal Welfare Acts. In 1963, she was awarded the Alfred Burt Schweitzer Medal from the Animal Welfare Institute. This period, she also wrote books expressing her love of animals, Forever the Wild Mare and Animals, Nature, and Albert Schweitzer, plus a book of poetry, No Room Save in the Heart. This picture of Anne and a beagle expresses her love for those lacking voice to protect themselves. Would you tell us something about your mother's animal rights work, please, Elissa?
Well, sure. Well, as you said, it was central to her life, and she considered it, her writing and her advocacy on behalf of animals, to be her most important work. And after she died in 2004, the National Press Club established the Anne Cottrell Free Animal Reporting Award to encourage others to follow in her footsteps. And that's been going now for several years, and there've been some wonderful entries and winners. Back to this photo, after discovering these beagles suffering in this sub-basement at the FDA in downtown Washington, D.C., she wrote stories about it, and she also formed an alliance with Senator Lister Hill of Alabama, very powerful chairman. He held hearings, and it resulted in the dogs being moved to a much better facility in Beltsville, Maryland. And also as part of that, she enlisted her friend, I think Maurine's going to talk about this a little later, but author and environmentalist Rachel Carson, to write letters to government officials calling for better treatment of these beagles. That campaign did result in the beagles being moved to a much better facility in Beltsville, Maryland. Maurine?
Yes, in the 1970s and 1980s, Anne was one of the first reporters to alert the public to a tremendous issue of environmental pollution, especially from pesticides. Through her syndicated columns and opinion articles in the Washington Post and Washington Star, she wrote about this at a time when it was practically unheard of. And she did become a close friend of Rachel Carlson. Carlson called her, I think, to help get information from the book that Carson wrote that was so influential, the book Silent Spring. After Carson's death, Anne herself successfully engineered a campaign to establish what you see here in this picture, the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge in Maine. And here she is at the dedication of the refuge in 1970 with Secretary of the Interior, Walter Hinkle. Lisa, could you tell us more about her belief in the need to protect the environment?
Well, yes, she was onto it, as you say. Really, nobody else was much writing about it. In fact, my mother had written a story about some woman being poisoned by dioxin because she'd fallen into it playing golf on a golf course. And anyway, Rachel Carson saw that article and called my mother on the phone. My mother said she almost dropped dead. The woman, this is Rachel Carson. Anyway, that was the beginning of a wonderful friendship and collaboration. And my mother aided her, gave her more material for Silent Spring. And of course, Rachel Carson helped my mother by writing letters for the campaign I mentioned about the Beagles. And also later in 1962, my mother arranged for, pretty rare at the time, public speech by Rachel Carson at the Women's National Press Club. And I think she also arranged that it was recorded, at least an audio version. I think cameras were there too, but that's important piece of history. Later, you mentioned after Carson died, my mother did write an article in This Week magazine, which was like the Sunday supplement and all the newspapers, calling for the establishment of a national wildlife refuge named for Rachel Carson. And she asked readers to, if they agreed, to please write to the Secretary of the Interior, Walter Hinkle. And the mail apparently poured in, and the department did choose a site in Wells, Maine, and they opened the refuge, which is very fitting because Rachel Carson had a beloved summer cottage there. And I just want to say again that my mother, she documented all of these things. The basement was unbelievable, 2 truckloads full of photographs, letters, stories, diaries. And I mean, I can only imagine what would happen if social media had been around back then. And I'm so grateful to the Library of Congress for taking all these materials and preserving them. And I also want to thank you both so much for the opportunity to let me talk about my mother. Thank you so much.
Well, she certainly was a person that we could talk a great deal more about. She had such a fascinating, interesting life. Unfortunately, time does not permit us today to list all the awards and tributes that she won, particularly for environmental writing. Nor can we list all the organizations to which she offered her services. These organizations work to advance the position of women journalists. And then, of course, many of them work to promote greater understanding and preservation of the natural world. But let's just close with this. In the words of Anne's journalist friend, Helen Thomas, with her great compassion and wonderful writing talent, Anne threw a spotlight on the suffering of humankind and animals. Anne can be called one of nature's noble women. Thank you. I'm sure if we have time, we'd be glad to answer questions.
Okay, well, again, if you want to email them, you can email them to, well, our website is www.AmericanWomenWritersNationalMuseum.org. And you can mail them. Our email is AWNM, the acronym, AWWNM1@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to forward them to these great women. I'm always so happy to be in the company of great women who are giving the presentation today and telling about other great women in the writing field. That's the mission of American Women Writers National Museum, to honor these fabulous women. When we had live meetings, several of the groups of women who came said to me afterwards, "Oh, thank you for having us. No one else has ever, our organization has ever recognized us as people and as writers." So I'm always happy to be part of that.